Donia for all of the great work that she's doing with women and ladies in STEM. And thank you very much to DevTO for inviting me here. And thank you so much for your time and letting me talk to you about how we brought a little bit of startup culture into a large enterprise. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Is that okay? Awesome. So my name is Shawn Konopinsky. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Nascent. For those of you who don't know who we are a company that works with other companies to bring their web and mobile products to market. So we're a team of about 30 designers and developers. We're about 4.5 years old. And for the first 3 years, we were focused on a class of companies that I would primarily categorized as successful startups. And so we were really lucky to work with Tumblr at one point in time, and we worked with eHarmony. And the reason why we jived really well with these companies was because they looked a lot like us. And I mean, aside from being zillionaires, I think what I'm saying is that they were relatively quick, agile, no BS, not a lot of bureaucracy, and they got the job done. And so for the longest time, we tend to work with people who look a lot like us. And so we did that, and then we were straying away from enterprise for strategic purposes. But I was out having drinks with a guy named Shawn Mandel, who had recently become the VP of Web Channel for TELUS. And Web Channel, what their mandate was to reinvent and reinvigorate TELUS's customer-facing digital products. So the website, the My Account application on mobile phones, and anything digital that customers interact with. So that includes things like in-store. And so he was lamenting to me over this beer about how, despite having a large organization and tons of resources, that it was taking him 8 weeks and 150 man-hours to make a copy change on a website, or why there were planning meetings to talk about meetings to talk about changing the text on the website, or why they couldn't keep the website up for more than a couple weeks once the text change was distributed and deployed to the website. And so this was about, I would say, a year after Eric Ries had come out with Lean Startup, and it was all the rage. So half jokingly, I said to him, you should just run your organization like a startup. And I say half jokingly because the enterprise is effectively a diametric opposite of startups. So startups are small. An enterprise, particularly TELUS as a telco, is a very large organization in terms of the number of people who work there. Startups move quickly and embrace failure as part of their process, and large enterprises typically do not move very quickly, as some people in this room can attest to. And I don't know of any executive that has been bonused out for failure in any of my circles. So startups listen to their customers and use data to try and validate their product making decisions. And telecom, they of course listen to their customers, but they also are beholden to their shareholders. And in addition to data, also have to consider the broader range of market in terms of making their decisions. So I'm not too sure exactly how he did it, but coming out of this conversation, this VP went ahead and convinced all of the senior executive team, the CEO, and senior leadership that the mentality and philosophy of lean and agile was the only way forward. So it was like a progression regression. So in order for enterprise to move forward, what they had to do is actually break themselves apart into smaller component pieces and effectively act like a startup. And then that was a requirement in order to reach their organizational objectives for the year. So TELUS hired 2 agencies. Nascent was one of them, and the other is called Heist, which is a design and data company as part of the partnership. And together with TELUS, the TELUS Labs was born. And it was structured as an innovation center that acts like a startup, but housed within TELUS. And it had the mandate of rebuilding TELUS's digital products one by one. And so when we started this thing, we didn't have any people assigned to it. The first thing that we started considering as part of this effort was the workspace. And before we get people together, we wanted to make sure that we had a space that was conducive to working in this way. So the first thing was the feeling that dedicated space was the key. And what this is a nice way of saying is we wanted to find a way to bubble ourselves from the rest of the bureaucratic organization, like it was something that was going to infect this ideal of startup. And so at one point we had even gone so far to say as we should actually set up an offsite office outside of TELUS's doors and put people from the three organizations into that space and start the labs there. Now, for a number of reasons that didn't happen, and we got set up on the 5th floor of 25 York down by the lakeshore, and it was definitely separated from the rest of the enterprise and sort of met that criteria of being a dedicated separate space. But we were very sensitive to trying to set up the environment in such a way that would allow collaboration. So floating desks and chairs for as much as we could. Of course, people have a tendency to want to stay in a single place, but we tried to keep it floating as much as possible so teams could orient and arrange themselves based on what needed to be done on a day-to-day basis. Whiteboards on the wall, blue tack, encouraging people to post their work on the wall in the hopes of facilitating this idea of collaboration. And also, it's one of the things was, funny enough, that this idea of making it feel like a startup. So we didn't want it to be luxurious. The idea was that sweaty and cramped was kind of was sort of a badge of honor when we came to creating this space. So beyond the working space, there were a set of immutables that were put in place to guide decision making, and this became the DNA of the work. And it became the DNA that binds the team, the tasks, and all of the sprints together. And so here they are. For those of you who work in smaller companies, these might seem pretty obvious. But in large vertically integrated organizations, there are some people that are making customer decisions that might not actually be going out and talking to customers, or may have never actually talked to a customer. Another hurdle in the case of TELUS was this massive existing infrastructure of large technology. So huge systems that the easy path was to work around them, but of course that work backwards, that affects the customer experience. So the mandate for this group was, as much as possible, to try and figure out what the best customer experiences and take the time to reinvent those systems if necessary. The second item on the list was put there because in 2012 there were only a handful of mobile companies in the world that had fully responsive websites. And TELUS wasn't one of them. So, of course, as part of this mandate, there was the notion that it was a no-brainer to ensure that the redesign of TELUS.com was done in a fully responsive manner. And the third one on the list embraces the notion that less is more. So people that were coming to TELUS are not coming there on their spare time. They are coming there to do a task. So the ability to get in there, do the task, and get out, and keeping things as simple as possible was a key component in terms of those principles. Optimizing performance, that goes to the notion of keeping the site up and keeping it performant. It doesn't matter how awesome your experience was, or how, in this case, how awesome the TELUS experience was. If it wasn't up and it wasn't performant and fast, then immediately that would affect the perception of performance. And then using data to validate assumptions. So as much as possible, using data. TELUS is a huge organization with enormous amounts of customer data from the call centers, from the various facets of analytics that they collect from in-store. So tapping into the right people and then using that data in order to validate assumptions was just a matter of finding the right people to talk to. And then finally, one team, one dream. So there was multidisciplinary teams, user experience, design, writers, engineers, QA, PM, all sitting side by side to solve these problems. So enabling this notion of one team, one dream, where these multidisciplinary teams can be involved from start to finish was key. So none of this starting with design and then handing off to development, but as much as possible, in an ideal case, trying to integrate it. And a lot has changed since late 2012 when the lab started, but those principles have pretty much stayed the same. At the time that the labs was set up, there were two main goals. The first was to rebuild TELUS.com, and this was because TELUS.com was actually fragmented. They had their mobility site, where you could go to all your mobile phone stuff, and then they had the wireline side, which was everything to do with home internet, home cable services, and they were actually completely separate sites with completely separate experiences. And so the first mandate was to reinvent and release a united TELUS.com with a re-envisioned design. But second was to establish a process so that TELUS could run it themselves without us. And this is an idea that we've coined called this notion of self-obsolescence. So as an agency coming into the situation, the last thing we want to do is make it so our clients are reliant on all of our resources for the whole time. So as part of our initial discussions, we actually started talking about how we can imbue some of the way that we were working into them so they can start running it, and we can eventually pull back as part of our strategy. The process itself is completely different from when we started. The activities themselves are pretty much the same. And we never really subscribed to any rigid form of agile like Scrum, but it was really just going in there, starting to work, finding that it wasn't working, readdressing it, coming back, trying something new, and it's this notion of continual evolution. But these activities more or less have stayed the same throughout. Teams interact live on a daily basis in daily stand-ups, and we try and pull in as much of the user-centered design process as possible into that. So sitting with customers up front, really understanding what their pain points are, talking to customer service agents, figuring out what people are calling and where their frustrations are, and then taking that into an insight process to figure out what we should actually be designing and what we should actually be developing. Creating lo-fi prototypes, again, sitting with customers, bringing them into the room, making sure that what we were creating is actually making a difference, and again, in high-fidelity prototypes, using HTML, trying to do the same thing. And then when we release, using quantitative data, so the analytics from the website, as well as qualitative data to try and, again, validate how we're doing things, and then where it made sense, use A/B testing. And this was the biggest thing. The last item was, not and much more, but the second last thing, iterative and lean. The notion of iteration was something that was typically frowned upon before. So you'd release something, and going back to it was a sign of failure. But we were able to actually, I think at one point we had even redesigned the homepage and released it 3 times, just because the data that was coming back and the results of speaking to customers based on the output of our work suggested that we didn't get it right the first time, and we have to go back. So that was an activity that is still part of that process today. And so that's the utopia of it, of course. And we knew that it wouldn't be perfect, but there were some surprising challenges that came up as we were going through the process. So there was a discrepancy between how the labs team was working and how pretty much every other single person in the organization worked. They had a focus on process instead of results, and so we were, of course, looking at data and trying to iterate and be agile and lean, and they were focusing on process because if they screwed up, they'd probably get fired. So it was a risk mitigation technique. So that's what they were doing outside. So they were requiring things like BRD documentation, and they worked waterfall. They were on set 8-week release windows, and there was a ton of governance. There was one situation, I wasn't a part of this, but I heard that in the quest to create the ability to use an avatar as part of your self-serve experience, so upload a picture of yourself or have a likeness of yourself as part of the self-serve experience, that took something like 3 to 4 meetings, including 20 to 30 people across the organization in order to try and get approval to do this, and it ended up not happening just as a function of that very thing itself. So that was one challenge. This was the other challenge. Well, in a perfect world, everyone would be sitting in the same room together. TELUS is a national company, so they have big offices in pretty much every city. And as a function of the way that the talent distribution worked, there were sprint teams that were actually spread across Toronto and Vancouver offices. So there was a communication breakdown that eventually happened, and it was for no fault of trying, but really like just not being in the same room and being not having consequential communication where you're sitting at your desk and you hear something going on and you can respond to it, really actually created a divide in the team. So it turned into a bit of an East Coast versus West Coast thing. And I mentioned before about legacy technology and the beasts that they are. The first beast that we ran into was navigating CMS solutions. So again, I don't know how many people work in enterprise, but enterprise loves paying really big companies to come in and deploy really big solutions, at least from what I've seen. So we came in there, and I think there's like a saying, I don't know who says this, but like nobody's ever been fired for hiring IBM. So I don't even know who actually says that, but apparently it's a thing. And so in this case, nobody ever got fired for hiring Oracle. And so Documentum was the CMS that was in there for a bit. And then we came in there and they were looking at FatWire, which I tried to read it. I didn't even read the documentation. I tried to read the documentation for it and I couldn't even get through it. So that was one thing. There was disparate technologies. And I'm not making this stuff up. There was PHP hosted in the cloud. And then there was an Apache Tomcat server sitting on a machine under some guy's desk in Vancouver, and nobody had any idea whose desk it was. That's another thing. And then there was misconceptions in terms of legacy support. So someone had made a decision at some point, or had said something that caused someone to make a decision, whereby all of the interfaces that were being created as part of this next generation rebuild had to support browsers that don't support JavaScript. So it needed to fail gracefully without JavaScript, which is kind of an interesting thing as well. So the technology and tools actually helped. So it's like coming out of that, there were certain things that certainly helped, and the technology was some of it. So for the East Coast, West Coast feud, always on communication. So guys in Toronto would come in the morning, dial up a conference phone number, open up a Skype video chat, and when the guys in Vancouver came in, they would log on, and there would be this virtual tunnel literally between these two labs rooms. So you can walk up to the screen and you can have a conversation. As awkward as that is, it actually worked and helped bridge some of the divide. And the agreement was made to go with Compass, SUSE, and SAS for CSS and the responsive grid system. Instead of going with FatWire, they decided that their needs were actually pretty minimal from a CMS perspective. So a in-house solution was rolled using HTML, JavaScript, and PHP. And there was also a custom UI elements framework called Frogger that was rolled as well. And so for the most part, tools were free, simple, and effective, and that really helped sort of structure some of the challenges, or structure solutions for some of the challenges in terms of wanting to be very rapid and be very iterative in nature. And so there was this notion of continual evolution. So the process evolved as the technology and tools evolved as well. Project management software changed quite a bit, settled on Redmine and Trello, and a combination of those two in the end. Instead of Skyping in and using an always-on phone connection, there was this comfort that developed where people could actually just pick up the phone and have conversations. And then we revisited recently the no JavaScript conversation and realized that there we got to the bottom of why we were doing something to support the 0.00 something % of browsers on the internet that don't have JavaScript enabled. And now that team is looking at Angular and Node.js as a solution. But all that to say is that the realization that we came to at the end is that despite the fact that we continually tweaked and modified the project and the tools, and adjusted the day-to-day aspects of the project. And again, these things are consistently evolving. And so no matter the workspace and the activities, it all comes down to the culture. And that was what we were trying to affect, because no matter what the tools or the approach and process that we put into place, in order to change how people were working, we couldn't throw a tool at it. What we had to ultimately do is start challenging and changing the fundamental assumptions that underlie all of those behaviors. And then that really was the sort of the aha moment when we started to realize that what we were doing is we weren't there to rebuild a website, and we weren't necessarily there to just implement a set of processes, but ultimately through osmosis try and change a culture. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak today, and I appreciate it. And I'm pretty sure I've gone way over, but I'll take questions if there's time. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
You talked a bit earlier about A/B testing and so on. Is there any particular examples of really impactful tests that you did and the kind of changes you made because of them?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by really impactful. There was a period of time where we were testing how people were, whether people were vertically scrolling through a page or were open to exploring horizontal navigation. So by impactful we mean trying to get people to phones that they may want to purchase.
I suppose from my perspective it would be like something that you never even knew was a problem. I mean, I've done a lot of this myself. It's stuff where you're like, you think it's fine, the navigation seems obvious to you, and you brought somebody in, they're like, I don't understand this, and you ran a test, and it turns out yes, people don't understand how to use this at all, and a simple tweak totally fixed it and made everybody happy.
Not really that I know of, but we also have some other folks from the TELUS team in the back, so they might be more attuned to some of those aha moments, but definitely come and find us after. We'd be happy to chat about it.
We talked a little bit about the conflicts you had between kind of the old school enterprise and the quality you're trying to create. And one of the largest ones I can think of that could possibly arise would be around the expectations of budget, right? Enterprise wants a solid, known quantity budget, whereas an agile team wants to be able to run away until it basically works the way it should.
Yeah.
How did you kind of bridge that gap?
We didn't. So I'll be honest with you. Two factors: limited stakeholders. So the as much as possible, the first iteration of the labs team was very well insulated. So and then what they had was an executive leader who basically just paved the way. So from a budgetary perspective, that was housed within that team and held internally. And then the VP and the director levels basically blocked and tackled to ensure that nobody was challenging that assumption. But where we do see that is integrating with other teams that might be building some of those large back-end systems and services and that's why they want to work waterfall. And so trying to get into a groove with them where we're working agile and we're working waterfall tends to be a challenge, and that, from what I've seen, tends to be the biggest disconnect there.
How do you, as a co-founder, protect your culture when you're hiring people?
How do we protect? So the question was, as a co-founder, how do we protect our culture when we're hiring people? It's extremely difficult, particularly when there's another culture being created that exists on its own. And I think there's some people in this room that can attest firsthand to that. But as a co-founder, what we're trying to do as much as possible is bring people back into the office as much as possible. That seems to be the epicenter. Creating a culture that's based around education and learning that's endorsed as part of our company, and then trying to bring people into that through lunch and learns and supporting things in team activities. And that seems to be right now, with people working in an integrated team off-site, is the best way that we found to do it.
Kind of touched on it again, but getting the TELUS employees that were used to the enterprise processes and stuff, how did you get them to kind of shift over to the new culture, and what was the time frame to get them to accept the new way of doing things, kind of breaking away from that old way of stuff?
Ongoing.
Yeah.
Ongoing. It took 3 months of, we did mock sprints very early on before we actually kicked off our real sprint. So there was a set of education that was built around how to do requirements gathering and how to prioritize product and how to validate. And we tried to cram them into 2-day events and go around and teach. But the reality is that that process that we were teaching was so far from where we were 3 months after we started that it was pretty much void anyways. So it was really just getting in the ring and figuring it together is by and large it. And it's certainly an ongoing process.
Find any Braille type of issues? Because I've been on the other side of the enterprise side of the coin. You have this young VP who's coming in, who's blocking and tackling for you, brings in an agency, does all the work. Well, I could do that too for that team, right? So if you're stuck on the TELUS side, what the hell, right? So I mean, obviously, either I'm finding my way out, or I'm trying to block you every step of the way because there's nothing in it for me.
Well, I think and that's where it goes to I think the mandate for the larger enterprise is in the case of TELUS at least, is being mandated that people to try and move as many of the teams as possible into this way of working. So the idea is in a utopian way is eventually the teams will interact much better because they will have that leadership that of course takes time. But I think it's at that point it's really just about sort of finding your way. Cool. Thank you.